We'll get started with the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining. Please keep your lines muted and your cameras off, and I'll pass it over to Alex.
Good afternoon. Thanks to Alex Miller and the Ohio AAP chapter for their work to make this training possible, and to Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation for its support of this work to address childhood food insecurity. I'm also Alex, but I'm Alex Ashbrook, and I'm the Director of Special Projects and Initiatives at the Food Research and Action Center, also known as FRAC. We appreciate that so many of you have joined this training. Our goal today is to give you tools and resources so that you can amplify your efforts to address food insecurity among the families that you serve and beyond. A quick word on the Food Research and Action Center. Next slide, please. FRAC works to end hunger in the U.S. through research, advocacy, and partnerships. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary. Today's training will center on a new toolkit to help pediatricians and their teams address food insecurity. Next slide, please. The toolkit was authored by FRAC and AAP and two pediatricians leading efforts to screen and intervene. Dr. Kofi Essel, who is joining us today as a presenter, and Dr. Kimberly Montez. Next slide, please. For today's training, we will begin with a brief look at how food insecurity is measured and some research that helped inform the development of the toolkit. Then we'll focus on opportunities for you to engage in this work. While we've reserved some time for Q&A at the end, we encourage you to use the chat box to put in comments or ask questions throughout the training. We'll be tracking the questions, thanks to Allison Lacko from FRAC, and your comments, and we will send out a post-training recap in case we don't get to all the questions during the training. Next slide, please. For those of you who've already been doing some of this work, please make use of the chat box to share what you're up to. We know there are some amazing efforts among pediatricians in Ohio, and we'd love to capture your work and share your expertise. Next slide. To help inform the development of the new version of the toolkit, FRAC and AAP conducted a survey with 327 currently practicing pediatricians. And there were two primary purposes in mind. First was to assess current knowledge about food insecurity and federal nutrition programs. And secondly, we wanted to identify current practices and existing capacity among the respondents for screening and intervening to address food insecurity. Next slide. Here's what the survey revealed. First, pediatricians believe they have a critical role to play in addressing food insecurity. All of the surveyed pediatricians agreed or strongly agreed that food insecurity contributed to poor health outcomes among children. And 96% of them agree or strongly agreed that patients should be screened for food insecurity in a pediatric clinical setting. And I would wager that you all feel strongly about that as well, or you probably would not be attending this training. Secondly, pediatricians view the federal nutrition programs as playing an important role in addressing food insecurity. 96% of those surveyed said that they strongly agree that patients should be referred to SNAP. And 98.2% strongly agreed that patients should be referred to WIC. Not surprising. The third point was that pediatricians widely screen patients for food insecurity. And this was a little surprising to the authors of the report. We knew that folks were screening, but based on this survey, a full 74% reported working in practices that screen some or all patients for food insecurity, although the screening tools do vary. And finally, we found that pediatricians indicated that they needed more training and resources to improve their efforts to address food insecurity. Many of the surveyed pediatricians feel unprepared to screen, about 20%, and intervene, 22% felt unprepared. And then the overwhelming majority, 81%, report not knowing if a family follows through on a referral. And I wanted to flag that some of you may know or work with Dr. Joel Davidson in Ohio. And he's working on that very issue, how to close the referral loop. And his work is referenced in the toolkit. So these findings were central to guiding the development of the toolkit. Next slide. So before we get into exploring the toolkit, I wanted to contextualize the term food insecurity and discuss what we're seeing during COVID-19. So it goes without saying that our goal is to ensure that everyone is food secure, has enough access to the foods that are needed for an active, healthy life. Unfortunately, tens of millions of people in the US live in food insecure households. And the level of food insecurity in these households can include members experiencing low food security or very low food security. Now, very low food security is the most severe form of food insecurity. And USDA used to call this hunger. Next slide. So many of you may know that each September, the USDA issues a report about food security in the US, and it asks households a series of questions about their experiences during the last 12 months. So the last data are for 2019, prior to COVID-19. And in 2019, 10.5% of all households were food insecure. That means 35.2 million people, including 10.7 million children, lived in households experiencing food insecurity, a rate way too high in one of the world's wealthiest countries. And you can also see from the pie chart that in Ohio, 12.6% of all households struggle with hunger, a little higher than the national rate. And this encompassed 4.8 million households. Next slide. Now, there are certain factors that put a family at risk for food insecurity, such as being low income, being headed by a single adult parent, having a member with a disability, and having children puts you at risk for greater levels of food insecurity. In 2019, 13.6% of all households with children were affected by food insecurity. And that's, again, higher than the rate for all households, which was 10.5%. So this graph looks at food insecurity trends for Black, white, and Latino households with children. And for all households, you can see how food insecurity rates decreased in the aftermath of the Great Recession. Obviously, because as the economy strengthened and families were able to access jobs and increase hours, their levels of food security got stronger. However, you can see also how these rates are disproportionate when we look at race and ethnicity. Black and Latino families are much more likely to experience food insecurity than white families with children. And if we're going to address food insecurity, we also must address these racial inequities that are fueled by longstanding structural racism and discrimination. Next slide. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has erased any progress we've made addressing food insecurity. During COVID-19, rates of food insecurity have not only widened, hitting millions of new families, but they've also deepened, meaning that the experience of food insecurity is more severe for family members. Now, Pulse data has been tracking food insufficiency during COVID-19, asking families if in the last 7 days, and remember that USDA annual report asks over the last 12 months, asking families which of the 4 statements best describes the food eaten in your household. So if a household answers sometimes not enough to eat or often not enough to eat, they are deemed food insufficient. And this is akin to very low food security. What was tracked in which was what was tracked in the pre-COVID-19 annual food security in America report. Okay, next slide. So this graph gives you a sense of how households with children are experiencing both deeper and wider levels of hardship resulting from the pandemic. Before COVID, 3.6% of households with children were experiencing very low food security, again, which is akin to food insufficiency, not exactly the same, but very, very similar. And that was at some point during the last year. But now we are seeing that around 12% of households with children are reporting that in the last 7 days, they do not sometimes or often have enough food to eat. Now, you can see how alarming that is, and feel free to put in the chat if this reflects what you are seeing at your practice among your families. It's important to note that this graph does not even get at how many families are not only experiencing food insufficiency, but they're also experiencing hunger, other hardships. I mean, the intersectionality of poverty, problems with housing, paying bills, and childcare, just to name a few. These are disproportionately harming Black and Latino families as well. On a plus side, we're starting to see rates go down. And this is in large part because of a robust government response that includes stimulus payments, a new child tax credit that's targeted to cut child poverty in half, and nutrition support, like improvements to the ability to access programs and increases in SNAP benefits. Next slide. And again, we're seeing disproportionate rates of food insufficiency with Black and Latino families with children having higher rates than white families with children. And these COVID-19 rates are unprecedented, and they're a huge cause for concern, since we know that even marginal levels of food insecurity are detrimental to the health and well-being of children. It makes the work that you all are doing to help address food insecurity of even more paramount importance. So for those of you who are interested in digging deeper into this research, you can use the chat feature to ask questions, or you can contact FRAC with any follow-up questions. Allison Lacko, who's on this Zoom, webinar, is doing lots of research on this, and we'd be happy to connect with you. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Essel as we begin to explore the toolkit. Take it away, Kofi.
All right. Thank you all for having us today. So I'm excited to talk to you all more about sort of the toolkit. Again, very high level. We want to give you access to the toolkit. You can see it in its entirety, read it in detail, but we'll give you a really good breakdown of what this toolkit looks like. This is our second edition. First one came out in 2017. This one really took advantage of all of your experiences that you've been sharing with us over the last couple of years as well. And we really try to do a good job of incorporating that into the toolkit so you all could kind of see lived experiences of providers, what's some of the updated research, and how do you do this in a very practical way. So again, we're really excited about it. Let's go ahead and get started and talk about the journey to where we came from, how we got here, and also what's in the toolkit. So first, initially, one of the groundbreaking policy statements that came out, one of the first of any professional organization, came from the AAP in 2015. It was a food insecurity policy statement, really encouraging providers across the board to screen and intervene, and most importantly, also to advocate for programs and policies that end childhood food insecurity. With the screening and intervening, the recommendation was to screen and intervene at scheduled, routine visits, right? So universally to do that, so that across the board, we weren't using our bias or our stigma or judgment to then identify families that were struggling with food insecurity. In addition to that, it highly recommended a tool to be able to determine if a family was experiencing food insecurity. One of the things that we often talk about is when we've done surveys in the past, when providers were sort of trying to determine if a family was struggling with hunger, they would use other factors. They would use sort of anthropometric changes. They would use clinical signs or laboratory signs. And we know that time and time again, we see that these factors are not reliable to be able to determine if a family is really experiencing or struggling with food insecurity. So what do we need to do? We need to use a better tool, such as a screening tool. One of the tools recommended is called the Hunger Vital Sign. In this Hunger Vital Sign that was promoted through AAP through this policy statement, you'll see a yes/no variable. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well in terms of optimizing our screening potential. But this is something that it was highly recommended in this toolkit, in AAP policy statement. One of the things that you see is when you look at the effects of food insecurity on households, we know that oftentimes we talk about associative studies, right? How the things the way that food insecurity affects individuals, we see a lot of associations in the studies, in the data. And what we know that time and time again, when we control for certain confounders, such as income, race, ethnicity, employment status, you still see these things sort of come to the surface. things like poor health status being associated with children who experience food insecurity, developmental risk, mental health problems, and poor educational outcomes. These are something we see consistently across the board. And just wanted to highlight, this is a tangible inflammatory effect on our families. And it's an important thing that we are choosing to address, as you all are doing so well now. And hopefully we can add a few more skills to your toolkit as well. So when we think about the lived experiences of families that sort of endure food insecurity, what does that look like? We tend to think of it through sort of a trajectory or a journey. The first step we tend to think about is this concept of food anxiety, a constant perseveration with where one's next meal is going to come from. This is something that we tend to see. One of our colleagues, researcher out of California named Dr. Hilary Seligman, often talks about this concept of a reduction of one's cognitive bandwidth. The palpable and toxic stress that comes from food insecurity hinders one's ability to shift and focus on many different things. That cognitive bandwidth that oftentimes may have been wide is now reduced because of that constant perseveration, that toxic stress in the brain. So that food anxiety is something you will hear often over and over again from families. Where is that next meal going to come from? After that food anxiety, we tend to see something happen, a decrease in the quality of food. We call this a monotony of the diet. The diet begins to become less quality. Nutritional quality begins to decrease. The variety and desirability of the foods begin to decrease. Sometimes people would associate food insecurity with the association with obesity, higher caloric density, more ultra processed foods, which end up being cheaper. And you tend to see with this high caloric density, low nutritional value, that you may see weight gain. So this is when you might see this concept of obesity tend to come up as well. After a decrease in quality of food, the next thing that, of course, that drops is a decrease in the quantity of food. And of course, adults will do everything they can to protect their children from experiencing a deprivation of food. So first, we have the adult food intake decreases, and lastly, the child food intake decreases. When we see children experiencing a depreciation or less food rather, then we know that this is more of an extreme of food insecurity. And although adults will do everything they can to protect their children, and they assume that their children are unaware, the data shows us time and time again that children are quite aware. And oftentimes you'll see, especially in adolescence, they will eat less food so their younger siblings can eat more food. So this is something that they are, it's a compensatory behavior as well. And lastly, the other thing you have to recognize is, even though you have food decreasing all the way down here, the palpable stress of food insecurity is felt all the way through this journey for children and everyone in the household, no matter if their food decreases or not. When we talk about understanding the lived experiences of families, we want to also talk about, what do we do to address food insecurity more effectively? The way we talk about this in the toolkit is through this model of 3 steps for success. Number 1 being prepare, number 2 being screen, and then lastly, intervening. Let's go ahead and dive into this. The prepare section is quite important, because we know that prior planning prevents poor performance. We've heard that time and time again. But more importantly, we have to understand that with a lot of these screening modules and approaches that we do, if we don't have anything in place to support our families, then we shouldn't be screening. They're great tools. You can collect research, but the idea of just collecting the data without actually providing anything is unethical, and it's a practice that we don't recommend. In fact, I really enjoy what one of the docs said out of North Carolina, Dr. Earls. Dr. Earls mentioned this. She said, don't start screening today if you haven't made a plan for how you talk to families and how you can link them with support. Ideally, be able to link families using a warm handoff, not just handing them a resource list. Now, we understand that sometimes when we enter into this world of screening around social determinants, the resource list is the best that we can do initially, right? Let's provide them with a resource. But we see time and time again that resource list may never leave that clinic room, may be left on the table, maybe in the trash can or in the elevator before the family even leaves. So oftentimes the connection from providing that resource to the family actually connecting to that resource may be limited. So we do recognize that that's the first tier, but there's some other things that we can do to really advance the opportunity to connect our families with these wonderful resources as well. When we think about this prepare module, we think about educating and training providers, following AAPs recommendations, incorporating the screening tools, and lastly, practicing empathetic communication in what we're doing. With educating and training, we want to make sure that we're educating and training our staff on food insecurity, what it is, federal nutrition programs, and local food and local food resources as well. The first thing we often talk about is identifying a hunger champion. Does this have to be the clinician, right? A lot of times it is the clinician that's doing this, it's championing a lot of this, but we want you all to recognize that you want to spread out the support here. You want to make sure that other members on the team are becoming hunger champions if possible. And you really just need somebody who can advocate, who can speak up, and who can make sure that remains on the docket for the team, the staff, the clinical practice, the institution. These are really important pieces. The other thing we want to make sure we do is train staff and leadership, again, about this toxic, invisible, oftentimes, and palpable stress of food insecurity. Really important thing that we do, as well as how do you address it as well. And also, we want to identify sustainable ways to address food insecurity as well. If you're in a large institution, getting institutional buy-in. If you are in a smaller practice, making sure that you figure out how to incorporate it into the electronic medical record, making sure that we have strong advocacy on the ground who can then support and making sure these efforts maintain and are sustained. The next thing we talk about is following AAP's recommendations. Of course, we talked about universal screening. That's ideal. All patients at all times, right? We understand that food insecurity is often waxes and wanes throughout the year. So this is a great opportunity to be able to identify families who are struggling at any point throughout the year. But we also recognize that this may be quite difficult to do. So we recognize that there are times you need to prioritize certain visits over other visits. And we've highlighted a few of those in the toolkit, in particular at routine well child visits, visits for nutrition concerns or ER visits. The initial hunger vital sign, when it was validated, was done in the ER setting. Hospital admissions, when patients come in, even when newborns are about to leave the hospital, making sure that they're well connected, or whenever other red flags are noticed, such as with nutritional concerns and things like that as well. You want to make sure you incorporate these efforts into the institutional workflow as well, right? And one of the things we often describe is making your downtime uptime. The idea of all these sort of lags in those clinical visits, right? When they're in the waiting room, when they are in the clinic room, waiting for you to be seen. These are great opportunities to incorporate screening questions, whether you do it in a kiosk, whether you do it and send it to the family before they even come into the visit. This provides sort of a protective environment for the family to be able to answer questions in a way that is reassuring and provides dignity for our families as well. The last thing we want to talk about in this category is practice. We want to practice ways that are sensitive, recognizing this is a very sensitive topic to our families. We want to make sure that we practice, we recognize that a lot of families feel shame and embarrassment initially when talking about this area. Any areas around poverty, this kind of thing makes families feel uncomfortable at times. We want to practice normalizing the questions. We ask this question to all of our families, all right, universally asking, and so families don't feel isolated and pinpointed. And lastly, you want to make sure you screen the family using the available screener in their preferred language. That's always something we want to make sure that we do as well. I want to show you a quick study. This was a study published in Pediatrics. It was actually 2 studies that were published, but it was a study done out of our colleagues at CHOP at Philadelphia. And they looked at a suburban practice, and suburban practices in particular, and saw what happens when you incorporate a new screening and intervention protocol in place. There's a lot of great quotes that came from these qualitative studies. And one in particular I wanted to highlight was this one here. I was really kind of shocked. This is a parent speaking. I was really kind of shocked because when the doctor did ask me, I was struggling at the time. I didn't want to lie, but I didn't want to be completely honest because I didn't want her to think I was neglecting my child. This idea of neglecting one's child comes up over and over again in the data. And we know that families oftentimes feel that if they were to share the truth of what's going on in their home, what if you take my child away from me? What if you call CPS? I don't feel like that's something I can feel comfortable in sharing here. So it's so important that we create a safe environment for our families and again, provide dignity for them in being able to answer such tough questions, but something that we can actually respond in a meaningful way with. The next category is screen. As we've identified before, if we cannot use all of these tools that we often have learned through time and using our eyes to be able to identify for families struggling with food insecurity, we have to recognize that food insecurity is invisible. And oftentimes being invisible, we have to use a better screening tool. So let's talk about that. There are a variety of screening tools available. There are some comprehensive screeners available too that you will see that some of you may be using that addresses other social determinants. Food insecurity typically doesn't travel by itself. maybe, and sometimes it's the first factor that drops when individuals experience challenges around income in particular, but it's not usually one that travels by itself. When you're entering into this space around addressing social determinants, food insecurity is often sort of a great gateway point for a lot of practices and clinical providers. Some of these comprehensive screeners you can find all across the internet. We wanted to highlight a project here called the Gravity Project, which is a great resource that a lot of our colleagues are working on right now that looks into the billing and coding and screening protocols around food insecurity. If you type that in, you can see other effective validated screeners that are available out there as well. But in general, you want to recognize that if you're going to screen, make sure you have something in place on the other end to be able to intervene. But when addressing food insecurity, one of the greater tools that we've seen time and time again that a lot of practices are using around the country is the hunger vital sign. It's 2 easy questions. You can easily incorporate it into your workflow. They are generally well accepted. They've been validated with multiple different groups, and they've been translated into a number of different languages as well. One of the things that we saw with the food insecurity tool, in particular, when the AAP put out its policy statement initially, you saw that the variable for the 2 questions of the hunger vital sign said yes or no, instead of often choose, sometimes choose, or never choose, which was actually the original intent and description, which was used in the gold standard screening tool that was used. But this was one that it makes sense. It's easy to ask, it's easy to incorporate easily into clinical practices. So that was what was really promoted initially. An interesting study here in AJPH in 2017 really explored this a little bit more. And I want to show you a little bit of that data. So we see here the 2 hunger vital sign questions for those who are unfamiliar. Within the past 12 months, we worried whether our food would run out before we got money to buy more. Within the past 12 months, the food that we bought just didn't last and we didn't have money to get more. Is the answer to this yes or no in the last 12 months? It's a great question, easy to ask as you've seen before. But again, when we ask the question asking often true, is this often true, sometimes true, or never true? It's a little bit of a tongue twister. It's harder to ask. Is this something we should be doing? Are we missing anything? Let's look at the study. So interestingly, in this study, what we noticed was that when we asked using the AAP tool versus the hunger vital sign, we missed up to 25%, actually more than 25% of families who screened positive by using only the yes or no tool. And you can imagine, what do you think people were answering when they were answering these 2 questions? The way this works with the hunger vital sign is if you answer the first question or the second question as true, which is often true or sometimes true, or yes, then the screener is positive for 1 or 2. You can imagine the way people answered the question. They answered with the variable sometimes true. And why is that? Sometimes true is an easy scapegoat answer. Doc, this may happen, but this happened a long time ago. Or this is a way I can answer this question and not feel like I have to commit so strongly to one side or the other. And you'll typically, if you ask these questions, you'll see more families indicate that versus the often true category. So we do recommend this Likert scale when you're screening using the hunger vital sign. Another really great tool, one of our colleagues who was a co-author on the toolkit, Dr. Montes here, she actually was a co-author on this paper. So they actually looked at some interesting work looking at whether you should write down your answer responses, so a family sort of circle a response, or should the clinician ask verbally towards the family. And what they saw was that asking verbally, we missed a number of patients screening positive. Why is that? Well, the reality behind asking verbally versus asking through sort of a written kiosk or circling is that it's also a safety thing, right? There's a stigma behind, there's a discomfort behind families sort of answering verbally versus being able to feel comfortable in their own space and answering sort of through that written version. Now, probing makes a ton of sense, but we do highly encourage that asking this through a written protocol makes a lot of sense and actually will increase your response variable. In this tool here, they use the yes or no variable. So imagine that muted their positive responses even more by using yes or no, and then also by using verbal or written. Step 3, our last step, we want to figure out how do we intervene. And of course, in general, we want to recognize the important role that federal nutrition programs play in addressing food insecurity. Oftentimes when I talk to my colleagues about addressing food insecurity, the first thing that we talk about is food pantries, food banks. And those are great by far. They're a really important piece to the toolkit, but they cannot do what the federal nutrition programs have been designed to do. They just don't have the funding and support behind them. When we think about intervention, we want to think about administering, connecting, documenting, and tracking, and then advocating and educating. With administering, we want to administer the right protocols to our families when necessary. So if a patient has anemia or anxiety or depression or other comorbidities associated with food insecurity, we address them in the way that we have known to address them. This is not addressed in the toolkit. These are things that we have been trained on, and we can really spend less time on addressing that. In the area of connecting our families, we want to make sure we connect our patients and families to federal nutrition programs and other food resources, right? So we want to train the team on what these programs are that are available. Every practice is going to be different. Every site is going to be different. What resources are available to you is going to be different. With federal nutrition programs, these are pretty uniform. So we want to make sure we support those and also other local resources, as we will highlight pretty soon as well. We want to make sure we determine who in the practice is going to facilitate the connection to these resources as well. It doesn't have to be only the clinician. It could be someone else, nurse, PCT, front desk staff. It could be a variety of different people who may come in to support you all in those efforts. And lastly, we want to make sure we develop partnerships with different community-based organizations to really move this process forward. To address this in its most effective way, we have to think about the role of clinical community partnerships. That's how we can address this in a more effective way. And you don't need to be thinking that you need to do all of this on your own. The reality is that in most states around this country, even your state, you have anti-hunger organizations who can really support you in these efforts to really figure out how do you screen and intervene more effectively, how do you create good partnerships, maybe with them or other partners in the community. And this is a group that you can really think about working with, even coming into your staff and giving presentations to give a better understanding of updates and everything like that as well. And lastly, this idea of, again, the key intervention we want to highlight is federal nutrition programs, recognizing their role in addressing food insecurity. There are a variety of ones that we will highlight today. We won't spend too much time on them, but the reality is SNAP, or food stamp program, but SNAP is what we call it, right, is for all ages. The WIC for women, pregnant women, infants 0 to 1, and children up to the age of 5. School meals, school breakfast, school lunch. These are also available. Also child care meals during daycare. After school meals, a lot of kids get more than 2/3 of their meals from school every day. And even summer meals, when school goes out, what is available to kids? How many times can they go to get meals? And where can they go around the city to get them? And lastly, I'll just quickly mention PEBT, the Pandemic EBT program, which money goes on individual SNAP card, or you receive a separate card, which you can use basically your funding from school for the year or for the semester to then be able to apply that into individuals, into their families' lives. Highlight really quickly, and I'm going to pass it on to my colleague to talk more individually about what's going on federally and also locally. We want to think about why federal nutrition programs. The reality behind federal nutrition programs is that they play a key role in addressing food insecurity because they've been seen time and time again, per the evidence, to improve food security, to improve overall health in eating, to improve health outcomes, reduce overall hospitalizations. And lastly, I want to highlight something that you should think about as well, stimulating the local economy. Why is that? Well, we know that for every dollar that's spent in SNAP, it boosts the local economy by $1.50 all the way up to maybe even $1.80. For every one food pantry meal that's provided, SNAP can provide 9 meals. So again, the funding is different. The way it addresses food insecurity is a different way. So recognize the importance of these federal nutrition programs as you move forward as well. I'm going to pass back to Alex.
Thanks, Dr. Essel. Well, Dr. Essel has provided you with a host of compelling reasons why health providers should start by connecting all eligible families to the federal nutrition programs. And we recognize that you are already doing a million things and asked to do a million more. So I wanted to lift up some of the supports in the toolkit, as well as in Ohio, to help connect your patients to key federal nutrition programs. So one thing we've developed is a federal nutrition program referral chart, and it has the different programs on the left. Here's an example of SNAP, how the program works, and then the last 2 columns are how the program works in Ohio. So we will be sending you a link to that referral cheat sheet, which we hope will be helpful for you in contextualizing the different resources that are available to families. But what I want to do now is to introduce you to 2 fabulous Ohio groups that are working on addressing food insecurity in Ohio, and are going to share you some updates on the programs. the federal nutrition programs have been expanded, and access has been made easier during COVID-19 so that families, don't have to go and face to face to apply for programs. For WIC, they can do telephonic interviews. And for SNAP, the benefits have been adjusted and people are getting higher SNAP benefits during COVID-19. So one of the things we're working hard at FRAC is continuing to make those improvements and make those improvements stick post COVID-19. All right, so first I'd like to introduce you to Jory Novotny from the Ohio Association of Food Banks. Jory, take it away.
Hi, thank you, Alex. I just want to thank all of you for your time, and I will be brief out of respect for all of the valuable information that you'll be learning and taking back to your practices. So I'm with the Ohio Association of Food Banks. We're Ohio's largest charitable response to hunger, representing 12 Feeding America food banks and their 3,600 local agencies providing emergency hunger relief. With that said, we also recognize that the federal nutrition safety net is the most critical tool in the toolbox for preventing and intervening in the food insecurity cycle. So I mentioned in the chat, you'll see a link to our website where we have a Find Your Food Bank tool. Of course, if you have patients with immediate emergency needs, we encourage you to refer them to our network, and you'll be able to click on their county to find information for how to get them the immediate help they need. With that said, on that same page, there's also information about how they can apply for SNAP in Ohio, as well as WIC, the Women and Infants and Children program, as well as information about programs like Pandemic EBT that was mentioned earlier, and summer meals, which I know that my colleague will be talking about in a bit. So please visit that site to learn more. Ohio has an online portal where individuals can apply for SNAP. It's at benefits.ohio.gov, and I will put that link in the chat. But I want you, instead of having to worry about all these different places, because you do apply for these different programs and different sources, you're welcome to bookmark that Get Help page on our website so that you have short-term and longer-term referrals that you can make. And briefly, I just want to also highlight the screen the screen you're seeing now is a screenshot of a new page on our website that has an overview and resources about what our network is involved with in the hunger and health space. We really are committed to addressing food insecurity as a social determinant of health, and we would love to partner with all of you in doing so. We really view consistent, reliable access to nutritious food as a form of medicine, and there are lots of ways, too many of which for me to go into now, about how we can partner with your providers, and you as providers can partner with our network. So I encourage you to take a look at that site to learn more, and please reach out. I think Alex to show my contact information. Just really appreciate your time on this issue, recognizing that food security is a critical space that we need to address for your families and children.
Jory, thank you so much for joining us and for all the work you do across the great state of Ohio. One thing I wanted to flag is that, we're talking about the need to intervene and connect people to these programs. And one key role of the health providers is to talk about the programs as positive interventions to address food insecurity in non-stigmatizing ways. And the toolkit has some information and suggestions on how you might do that. But one of the key intervention points is the WIC program. Only half of eligible people across the United States participate in WIC, and there's a huge drop when babies become infants at age 1. WIC is available for children up to age 5. So it's really important to think about opportunities to connect the toddlers and young children to WIC. Understanding what's in the WIC food package. WIC is potentially getting a lot stronger in Ohio for 4 months. There's funding to basically double funding for fruits and vegetables. So WIC is an underutilized resource, and there are a lot of reasons people don't use it. But one reason is that they don't necessarily know that they're still eligible after a year, and that they don't know what's in the food package often. So please lift up that resource. All right, now I'm delighted to introduce Shannon Amos with the Children's Hunger Alliance. And Shannon will tell you a little bit about their work, as well as opportunities to connect with Children's Hunger Alliance and the different nutrition programs that they're experts in. Thanks, Shannon.
Yes, absolutely. So I will be brief in my comments as well, and everything that has been shared already is excellent and really kind of tees up this conversation really nicely with Children's Hunger Alliance. So we are also a statewide agency focused on hunger. We are not an emergency food provider in the way that a food bank or a food pantry is, but we do focus on those federal child nutrition programs specifically. We are a direct sponsor of provisions of food and reimbursement within daycare homes, childcare centers, after school and summer programs. We focus on school breakfast expansion, and we also provide nutrition and physical activity programming. Next slide. So I wanted just to provide a couple of resources from our end that are kind of quick go-tos. So we have a list on our website. These are hyperlinks. So once you guys are able to receive the slides, you can click on these hyperlinks, or I can share them in the chat as well if we have time. We have a list of open after school and summer programs. We operate about 200-ish summer programs, about 300 plus after school programs where we provide food directly to programs. This is ever changing, and so we keep this list updated on our website. Certainly there are more food programs out there available with after school drop-in programs and summer drop-in programs than just us. So the second link there is the Ohio Department of Ed Summer Food Service map, and they only update these slides, or I'm sorry, they only update this map in the summertime. And so this map will be updated in June for the summer. And this map is also correlates with the USDA map for summer feeding sites across the country where you can enter a zip code or a city. These are all searchable sites. If you call the 1-800 number, it's going to link you back to either entering your entering the website information. I'm not sure if this one is going to have the option for entering a zip code to connect you to a food service site. But I also, so those are 3 resources that are great and can become bookmarks as well on your list. I also wanted to mention, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of the USDA flexibilities for school food are extended through next year. So all students eat for free this summer, as usual. All kids always eat for free in the summer at designated locations and qualified locations. And through school year 21-22, all kids will eat free just as they are this school year. So breakfast and lunch will be available to anybody regardless of income. So we really have a good opportunity to promote school meals, the nutrition value that they provide, and get more nutritious food to more kids, and start the day out right. And we know breakfast, of course, sets the day out right for a lot of students to learn at their optimal, learn optimally, and just reduces behavior issues and all sorts of other things that benefit the school environment. So those are some quick resources, and I just wanted to make a note on the school meals for next year, and I will turn it back over.
All right, thank you all for those updates, and hopefully you all got the contact information. You'll get these slides so you can explore that a little bit more as well. So just to kind of land the plane and try to leave a few seconds for questions if we can, I just wanted to highlight a few other things for all of us to be able to see. So another big important piece about intervention, or intervening rather, is documenting and tracking in your medical record. So when you document and track in your medical record, we have codes like Z59.4, which is technically the food insecurity code that we've been encouraging. But there's a whole practice around how you do that more effectively. And this is a tool that you'll see in the toolkit that has been well written to explore how do you do that most effectively as well. So that's an exciting piece that you'll see in the toolkit as well. And then lastly, this piece about advocating and educating. We have to advocate and educate to address food insecurity and its root causes. You want to think about these root causes when we're addressing food insecurity, remembering that to address food insecurity, you have to use a multifaceted approach. Just providing food alone does not address food insecurity by itself. We have to recognize the role of structural causes, such as structural racism, poverty, concentrated poverty, inadequate wages, housing instability. All of these factors matter. And if you think about stepping out of the four walls of your practice to be able to use your voice, you can do that in a multitude of different ways. And we know that it also has a direct effect on food security and stabilization of a household as well. I'll pass it back to Alex.
Thanks. So the anti-hunger world needs your voice in addressing food insecurity. No one makes a point more persuasively than a pediatrician who can talk about the hungry child they see in front of them. And there are many ways to engage in advocacy. You don't have to be the person who testifies before the Senate Agriculture Committee on the need for a strong child nutrition reauthorization. Although we're very grateful for the new AAP president, Lee Beers, who just did that and did a phenomenal job. You know, advocacy can be local. It could be working with your children's schools to make sure they're offering breakfast, lunch, and participating in after school and summer meals, and improving the nutrition by getting feedback from students. It can be writing an op-ed, a blog. There are so many different ways you can engage in advocacy. And one doctor had pointed out that, you know, it's really hard for families to access some of the WIC clinics. Well, there's a local advocacy opportunity to figure out, you know, if you can continue using the telehealth calls, or have transportation vouchers for families to get to the WIC clinics. So there's a whole host of opportunities, and we really encourage you to take a look at them. In terms of sort of the big picture priorities moving forward, for FRAC, one of the most important things we're working on is locking in the benefit increases for SNAP. SNAP is an incredible program that improves nutrition, health, and well-being, but it could do even more if the benefits were adequate and lasted throughout the month. It's based on a very outdated food plan called the Thrifty Food Plan, and we're really concentrating advocacy efforts in increasing that food plan, so it really helps families throughout the entire course of the month. Another issue we're advocating on with AAP is adopting free healthy meals for all students. Again, I think it was Jory talked about how school meals are going to be free for all students next year. We want that to continue because every child needs to access a nutritious meal. Next slide.
Awesome. All right. So really quickly, and Alex really drove this home, but I just wanted to emphasize, you saw number 10 on that list, educating the next generation of providers. Many of you all do that right now in your hospitals, in your clinics, in different settings. You do this on a volunteer basis. Recognize that that's a huge opportunity to advocate as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on this next slide, but I do want you to see this because it really sort of highlights what Alex was mentioning. The reality behind SNAP, we know that SNAP benefits typically, oftentimes when you see a patient or a family receiving SNAP, you're like, oh, they don't have food insecurity. Food insecurity doesn't exist in their household because they have SNAP, everything is fine. We have to understand that in greater than 99% of counties around this country, SNAP is inadequate. It's just not enough. It's about $1.40 per person per meal. And if you look at how the benefits are spent over the course of the month, you can kind of see what happens here. Look at households with children in blue and all households. So look at by day 7, you receive your benefits on your SNAP card at the beginning of the month. By day 7 of receiving your card, more than 50% of the benefits are spent. By day 14, more than 80% are spent, leaving less than 20% for the last 2 weeks. Imagine what happens at that time. Well, you know what happens. Adult caloric intakes begins to decrease. You see increased hospitalizations, more diabetic episodes. Like all these things occur near the end of the month. And recognize what happens now that you've had this period of time where you haven't eaten. The next month, you're trying to then spend even more to sort of catch up. So it creates these maladaptive behaviors with food. So yes, what can we advocate for? For better funding for SNAP. And we've seen how the advocating around that has really improved sort of what we see today. And we're seeing sort of some testing being done where we're increasing SNAP dollars, especially during COVID. And we expect that to have a significant benefit, just as it did during the last recession after the 2007 to 2009 recession. Now, when you think about other resources to help you advocate, check out the FRAC website, check out AAP Federal Advocacy website as well. You'll find some great tools on there to advocate. And I leave you with this final slide to take home. Final takeaways. Number one, make sure you screen patients for participation in the federal nutrition programs. Make sure when indicated, provide application assistance if you have eligibility or capacity for that, or direct to your anti-hunger group to help with that as well. Make sure to provide specific information on where patients can access these programs locally. By just saying SNAP or WIC, that connection is not always made. So remember that idea of the warm handoff is key here. Make sure to integrate this information into your existing health record. It helps you keep track of what's going on, helps you keep track of if families' needs have been met. All kinds of things occur with that as well. Promote the federal nutrition programs to your patients, recognizing the role that they play. You want to manage and connect with your community partners. Provide referrals to community partners. Again, you have to establish that. That starts with you preparing. You want to make sure you use non-stigmatizing language in messaging, as Alex mentioned, and you can see a lot of good examples of that in the toolkit. Update each other on federal nutrition programs and local resources. Again, teaming up with our colleagues that spoke today is going to be really helpful for you. Follow up with your families to make sure that the resources help. And then lastly, consider connecting with online community resource platforms. You may have some locally that you could use, or people use a tool called Aunt Bertha oftentimes, but you have a tool as well that you can use on through Ohio, and you can find some of these resources very handy. We want to open up the floor for question and answers for a few minutes. We want to thank Anthem for their generous support, really helping us bring this second edition toolkit to life. And so we really appreciate their support on this. And thank you for your time today. How can we answer some questions for everybody?
I have a question for Jory or Shannon about PEBT. That's an important resource that folks may not be familiar with, pandemic EBT. Do you all have information on how that's working in Ohio?
I think, Jory, you're better to answer that than me.
Jory, you're not coming through. And I can answer it nationally if that's helpful too. Okay, it seems like we are having a mishap with Jory's communication, but basically the concept behind pandemic EBT is because of so many schools shuttering and there being virtual learning. Many students across the country have lost access to the school meals they need to solidify their nutrition. So what the federal government has done is created a program where they get funding for lost meals that's put on an EBT card that you can use in the same venues where you can redeem SNAP benefits. So that's been a huge help to families. The program has, already shown that it's helped reduce food insecurity. It's been expanded to children under 6, although for that population, it's only available for families that are on SNAP. So it's a little trickier to get it to certain families, and it's has to be in an area where childcare has been closed throughout the county or some other demarcation. But one of the things that's in the president's new plan, the American Family Plan, is to bring summer EBT, which is something FRAC has been advocating for years, which is the same concept where you put benefits on a EBT card for children who are losing access to free and reduced price school meals during the summer, where we see hunger spikes. There's learning loss for kids that can't avail themselves of park and rec centers or camps or summer enrichment programs because they live in areas that don't have those important enrichment programs. So the idea is to give them at least money on a card so that they can purchase, their parents can purchase the foods the children need.
And think also about the role of food sovereignty here as well, right? So you give the money directly to the family. The family can choose what cultural foods and what foods are important to them to really, again, enhance their own health. And that health is, again, viewed through a more holistic lens in that realm as well.
Thanks, Jory, for your explainer in the chat. See, she's an advocate. She can pivot. If the volume's not working, she'll do the chat.
Any other questions we missed on the chat box, or anybody want to ask any questions out loud?
Well, Kofi, I'll ask you a question. What led you to engage in this work and continue it? And now you're really a national leader on the screen and intervene work. What was the motivating factor for you?
It's interesting. I think it's becoming more part of the lexicon in medical school, but I actually didn't know how pervasive this was until I was doing a seminar in med school, my last year of med school, about to leave med school and go into pediatric residency. And I was talking about this topic of engaging culturally and linguistically diverse learners and how food and nutrition is so important in engaging our learners. So as I was doing research on that, I came across this concept of hunger and food security. And I was like, oh, that couldn't be as big as we talk about that all around the world in America. And that's what really exposed me to it. And I started seeing this overlay between obesity and food insecurity, because I had done a lot of work in obesity at that time. And they started using this term of obesity paradox. And as I started to explore the social determinants around that, that really opened up the door down this pathway. And then I got to work with some amazing advocates in the District of Columbia. And that just sort of opened up these doors into working in this space so much. And also just seeing how intervening and addressing this in the clinical spaces, how much it opens the door for further conversations with families and really, again, meeting them where they are. And I think that's so important.
Thanks. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end the webinar if there aren't any more questions. Thanks for those really inspirational comments and for all you do to address food insecurity. And we're really thrilled to be doing this work in Ohio. Please use us as resources. FRAC is available. You know, our expertise is in the federal nutrition programs, looking at national policies and opportunities to improve and strengthen them. You have great partners in Ohio who you can reach out to, and have created a wealth of Ohio specific resources. And let us know if you have research ideas, if you need research on that we can help share or crank out for you. We're delighted to partner in whatever capacity we can, and encourage you to take a look at our website and sign up for action alerts and news briefings to help inform this work. And Kofi, take it away.
Alex,
you got the floor for the last comment.
Yeah, okay, great. So Polly mentioned a quick question we'll answer in 1 minute. Polly, thank you for that question. So I think the question says, what would be a tip you could give to a new resident pediatrician to address this work? And I think the first thing that I think of is awareness. The awareness of how pervasive this is and then how it looks and presents itself. We all bring our own biases and stigmas to all the work that we do because of our past experiences. Really being able to confront those and allow your colleagues and yourselves to sort of get a deeper dive into what food insecurity is, how it presents itself, I think it's going to be so rich. So the first thing I would do is really try to inform and make your other colleagues aware. And then at the same time, try to figure out if you can incorporate some of these screening intervention practices into your settings, recognizing that a whole practice may not do that, but every now and then you may be able to slip that into engagement with your family. And if you, especially if you have resources on the back end, it's a great way to really start helping meeting your families where they are. And again, ideally making it part of a protocol, but as a resident, you may not have that much influence yet, but at least starting to figure out how can you sort of start doing this at your level, I think is critically important. And I thank you for that question. Thank you all again for your time. Happy to answer questions in the future. Please reach out, keep in touch, and yeah, keep on the good work.
Thanks again to Ohio AAP for their flawless support in rolling this out.
Thank you all so much for speaking today, and thank you everyone for joining.